Wagner chief accuses Kremlin of trying to blow up his men in public flogging. In yet another angry social media post, Yevgeny Prigozhin said there had been no provocations from Ukrainian forces, but surprises awaited us on the other side. The head of the Russian mercenary group Wagner has accused Russian officials of trying to kill his men by planting mines in areas they operate. In a post on Telegram, Yevgeny Prigozhin claimed his forces had found hundreds of explosive devices in about 10 areas. It was not necessary to plant these charges in order to deter the enemy, as the area they were found is in the rear area, he said. Therefore, we can assume that these charges were intended to meet the advancing units of Wagner. Wagner forces have in recent days been pulling back from their positions in the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, handing them over to regular Russian units. Prigozhin said that during this operation there had been no provocations from Ukrainian forces, but surprises awaited us on the other side. When asked who was responsible for placing the devices, he said, "We conducted investigative actions jointly with law enforcement agencies to document everything. Currently, investigations are underway. Those who put these explosive devices in are representatives of the Ministry of Defense," he added. "We assume this was an attempt at a public flogging." Prigozhin said none of the devices had exploded and none of his men had been killed or injured. The Wagner chief is closely linked to President Vladimir Putin, and the two started their careers in business and politics in their native St. Petersburg following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. He has been locked in a long-running feud with the Kremlin over ammunition supplies while his forces have been fighting in Ukraine. Earlier this week, he said, "If the whole chain of command is 100 failed and will only be led by clowns who turn people into meat, then we will not participate in it. The only solution, in order to establish a lasting peace, there is only one solution: the end of the Russian Empire. Otherwise, a cessation of fighting will only allow the deeper problem to fester." Many proposals have been made regarding how to end Russian aggression in Ukraine. Many have offered off-ramps surrendering to Russia and acquiescing to Putin's supposed need to save face, thereby ensuring a frozen conflict. Ukraine has insisted that the only real end to the war is a return to the 1991 borders. Neither proposal is a solution in the long term. As long as Russia remains an empire, global security and Ukrainian sovereignty remain at issue. Accepting the Ukrainian proposal means simply that the next Russian aggression is temporarily postponed. People cannot live in constant fear. Since the full-scale attack on Feb. 24, 2022, at least 3 movements have evolved. The first was the Free Nations League, a coordinating body in Europe comprised of nations currently held captive within the current Russian Empire, known as the Russian Federation. The second was an American association of nations still trapped in the Russian Empire, as well as several outside of it, but within the sphere of continuous Russian pressure. Now these nations have agreed to join efforts with nations held captive or repressed by another evil empire, the Chinese People's Republic. The end of evil empires is the mantra of this joint effort, looking back to a time during the Cold War when the United States, in its wisdom, and with significant prodding by Eastern European nations, passed legislation designating the third week of each July as a time to remember those nations that were a part of the Soviet Union or its satellites known as captive nations. Ultimately, but not fully, this action prevailed. In July 2023, there will be a march in Washington, D.C. from the Capitol to the White House displaying the flags of some 20 nations currently suffering under Russian and Chinese oppression. The significance of this event lies predominantly in its creation. These are very different nations, entirely different cultures with little in common except for the desire to be free. Why should the U.S. pay any attention to this movement? The first reason is an obvious moral one. In this regard, America has a role to play in view of its own history. However, even a cynic can find justification to support this cause. Since World War II, a conscious effort has been made by the global democratic community to ensure global security. As the League of Nations faltered, the United Nations supplanted it and persevered, albeit not successfully on all fronts. Its purpose was manifold, but its foremost goal was directed at global security. A monster, however, was forged. The UN Security Council. People throughout the world disparage the work of the UN and scoff at the waste of the Security Council. This is a lesson learned. And yet, the ridicule is misplaced or misapplied. I recently spoke with a representative of the Uyghur people who are being mercilessly and intentionally slaughtered by the Chinese in East Turkestan, known in China as Xinjiang province. He laughed at the UN's lack of efficacy. Rather, he suggested the repressed nations should seek a dialogue with the United States Congress and the White House. He is right and wrong. Freedom and global security need a champion, but the U.S. cannot do it alone. God knows we have our own problems. However, the U.S. must continue to lead the global community. It is easy to disparage international structures because so far in history they have proven to be feckless. However, international organizations and associations are the future. The internet, the global economy, global environmental issues, and poverty have proven that. I refrain from domestic criticism because that merely degenerates into bickering. I certainly wish that Ukrainians in America, Democrats or Republicans, would wake up on a single issue. That issue is Ukraine, and that issue ultimately mandates the end of the Russian Empire. Let us widen our horizons and work towards the end of all evil empires. I certainly feel for the Uyghurs in China and pray that they feel for the plight of Ukrainians suffering from Russian aggressions. I try to stay away from John Lennon, but in this instance, the phrase, "the world will be one," resonates. But, John, there must be nations and religions because people need both. How about, imagine if there were no empires? Only then will the world be free and secure. Only then will the world be free and secure. Only then will it be one. Zelenskiy responds to Donald Trump's plan to stop war in 24 hours. Speaking of next year's U.S. presidential elections and a possible Trump victory, the Ukrainian president said, "In a situation like this, you are afraid of changes." President Zelenskiy has said he didn't understand recent comments made by Donald Trump in which he claimed he would stop Russia's war on Ukraine in 24 hours, saying he could have done so while previously in office but didn't do so. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he said, "I didn't understand when Donald Trump said in 24 hours I will bring Putin and Zelensky to the table and end the war. He could have done that, but it didn't happen." Yes, the question probably wasn't pressing at the time because there was no full-scale invasion. But our territories were occupied. Trump was elected president in 2016, 2 years after Russian forces invaded and illegally occupied Crimea and the parts of the Donbass. The war in Donbass continued throughout all 4 years of his presidency. The only time Ukraine came on the radar of us politics in any major way during Trump's term in office was during a scandal in which Trump tried to coerce Kyiv into investigating his political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter by threatening to withhold aid to Ukraine. Speaking on Thursday evening, the former president suggested that if he was re-elected to the White House, the current U.S. military support for Ukraine could instead be replaced for a push for negotiations in which Kyiv would likely lose territory illegally occupied by Russia. Zelensky was asked if the prospect of a Trump victory in next year's U.S. presidential elections adds pressure to successfully end the war before a possible change of administration. Of course, I want the war to end as soon as possible. It has nothing to do with if the U.S. administration will remain the same or change, he replied. President Biden is the president during a full-scale war and has been more helpful to us than President Trump if we are talking about administrations. But at the same time, we must remember that there was no full-scale war at that time, and I'm not sure how Trump would have acted at that time. In a situation like this, you are afraid of changes. And to be honest, when you mention a change of administration, I feel the same as anyone. You want changes for the better, but it can be the other way around. Trump's comments came on Thursday night during a town hall event on Fox News, where he also said he got along with Putin and made bizarre comments about the current waves of Russian missile and drone attacks against Kyiv. When asked about Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he said, "I want to stop that war. I don't want that war to continue. And I'll stop that war, mark my words, I'll stop that war in 24 hours. The event's host, Sean Hannity, then interrupted to say, "Mr. President, let me ask. Serious question. How do you stop that war in 24 hours? He replied. "I will get them into a room, and I know an exact way. You tell one you're not going to get anything unless you make a deal. You tell the other one they're going to get a lot unless you make a deal. And you just sit them, and you put them, and you have to make a determination." Although Trump did not say which one was which, His comments appear to suggest he would force Ukraine to accept the loss of territories illegally occupied and annexed by Russian forces, with the threat of rewarding President Putin with even more if they refuse to accept his offer. Elsewhere in the interview with the Wall Street Journal, Zelensky said his enemy, Russian President Vladimir Putin, should be afraid of the strength of the world. He called him a cornered animal. He is afraid to lose his life. Zelensky also expressed frustration at Western leaders ahead of the NATO summit in Vilnius next month, as pressure has grown to grant Ukraine a roadmap for joining the alliance. If we are not acknowledged and given a signal in Vilnius, I believe there is no point for Ukraine to be at this summit, he said. He acknowledged that Kyiv understood it was not possible to join NATO during the Russian invasion.